Today's daf, Be'ez Hashem, is Masechta Horayos, which we started yesterday, daf Gimel, and we just want to just review some of the psukim. It's very crucial that you know the psukim in Chumash. The psukim in Chumash describing a person who does an avera and he does it by mistake. So he has to bring a carbon chatas. And here the Chumash says, "V'nefesh achas techtcho b'shkoga," if one person makes an avera. It's from the regular Jewish people. He makes a mistake. Let's say he carried on Shabbos by mistake. That Hashem said, "Don't do this mitzvah. Don't violate this commandment," and he did. V'ashem, and he was guilty, and he violated. Not every commandment you bring a carbon chatas. If you speak lashon hara, you don't bring a carbon chatas. It's only a type of mitzvah, a type of loisa, say, a violation which you would get kares for. So oi, hoy the elav chadasai. This oi is unusual, but oi you always translate as or, but here you'll translate as if. If he found out he did an aveira shechata and he wants to do a kapara, then he should bring a female goat. It's embarrassing to bring a female goat for your avera that you did. And the Torah tells you, you put your hand on the chatas, and we shech the chatas in the north side of the azara, the north. Then you grab the blood, the kohen, catches the blood after you slaughter it. He takes the blood in his hands, in with his finger from the keli, and he puts it on the corners of the outside mizbeach, and he dips his hand, puts it on the corner, and then he wipes it on the side of the vessel. And he does this to four corners, and then he spills the rest of the blood to the side on the mizbeach. Fine. So he brings also, you have to take the diaphragm, the kidneys, and the fats, and you bring it onto the mizbeach. And then, if you do all that, the Eibishter, the kohen brought about an atonement for you, and Hashem forgives you as if you never did it. Okay, that's if he doesn't. So you could also bring not only a female goat, but a female sheep. Let's go a little further, and then we'll start the Gemara. V'im kol adas Yisrael yishku. Here is what we're discussing in the whole Masechta. The Torah tells you that if the Edas Yisrael, if the 71 people in the Sanhedrin, all 71 said, you're allowed to do this Avera. Let's say they said you're allowed to carry on Shabbos. V'nelam dova meina kol, and they forgot, they didn't know about that halacha, that you're not allowed to carry on Shabbos. V'asu achas mikol mitzvahs Hashem ashlo yasena v'ashemu, and everybody, the majority of the Jewish people, followed whatever the Bezdin said. And we're going to learn that some hold you don't need the majority, you just need even 7 shmotim. But everybody followed, the Bezdin said you can carry on Shabbos. The Bezdin realize they made a mistake. The krivu hakohol parben b'kol chata v'yoyel lifnei moed. Here they bring a 3-year-old cow, and who brings it? Either the Bezdin brings it, or every shevet brings their own par. And this is called the par helam dava shel tzibor. Now, here, because everybody is following the Bezdin, right? So therefore, the Bezdin is bringing this kapara on behalf of all the people. So therefore, you would say that the people are exempt from bringing their own personal karbachatas, because here it's being brought. One big cow is being brought by the Bezdin. And they soimich them. They bring the blood is sprayed on the towards the pareiches, and also it's put on the mizbeach hapnimi, and then they burn this whole thing. And the Chumash ends off over here. You should know chatas hakahal hu. We don't have time to read the whole psukim, but chatas hakahal means that although the Bezdin made the mistake, it's really a sin for the entire congregation, because the entire congregation, if they would have been upright, their Bezdin would not have made any mistakes. So now let's start the Gemara. But before we begin, let's just point to the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that if the Bezdin paskin that you're allowed to eat, let's say, fats, certain types of fats which are non-kosher, and this only a yochid v'asa shoygig al piyam. Here, what the problem was that not the majority of Klal Yisrael followed Bezdin. Let's say 30% of Klal Yisrael followed Bezdin. So our Mishnah holds, nevertheless, even though the Bezdin is not going to bring a par helam dovish tzibur, because only a minority followed their psak, nevertheless, the individual is potter. The individual is potter from bringing his own carbon chatas. So now we go Amid Beis, Amar Rav Yehuda. It's about the middle of Gimel Amid Beis, Beis Amid Beis, and we're going to have to move a little fast. Amar Rav Yehuda said, Zu Divrei Amar Shmuel. Shmuel said, our Mishnah is following, the Zu Divrei Rav Yehuda is going the opinion of Rav Yehuda. Ava Chachamim say, Yachid she'asa b'hayra is bezin, if the individual followed the hayra is bezin, which means that if the 30% followed the bezdin, then what we're going to say is chayav. Everybody is chayav to bring their own carbon chatas. There's a chachamim that disagrees with our Mishnah. My Rabbi Yehuda, where do you see Rabbi Yehuda is of this opinion? The Tanya we learned in a brisa. If nefesh achas techter mishkaga ba'asoisef, if a person did an aveira, harei elu gimel miyotim. There's three limitations in this pasuk. Achas shkaga ba'asoisa. He did a mistake. So we darshan from one of those limitations. If a guy made the mistake by himself, chayiv. Then you bring a carbon chatas. B'hayra is bezdin. If he was following the psak of bezdin, even though the majority of Klal Yisrael did not follow the psak of bezdin, nevertheless, potter, you're going to be potter. Now notice, so this is a proof that, notice it doesn't say Rabbi Yehuda said this, but the point of the brisa is that if you follow the Hayrois Bezdin, you're exempt from your own personal chatas. But it doesn't say that Rabbi Yehuda said this statement. But anyway, we're going to talk about that in a minute. My Rabbanan, where did the Rabbanan hold that even a Yachid that does the Aveira is obligated to bring their own carbon chatas? If 30% of Klal Yisrael did the Aveira, even though Bezdin paskin that you're allowed to, they have to bring their own carbon chatas. Tanya, we learned in a brisa, I would still say, miyat kol shechatu chayavim, shein mein bezdin yadvian al yadein kol. Roiv kol shechatu yehi parter, shei bezdin mevian al yadein par. This brisa is a little cryptic, and the Gemara is going to explain. But what does this brisa mean to say? What does this mean that if the Chumash is teaching you that 30% of the tzibur that did the Aveira, they're obligated to bring their own carbon chatas because they're not following the psak of Bezdin. So of course they have to bring their own carbon chatas. Bezdin mayavet teil. Shaloi b'hara is Bezdin mimaisa shaloi b'hara. Since Bezdin is not bringing a carbon over here, of course the minority that did the Aveira have to bring their own carbon chatas. Ella b'hayra'a. This brisa holds that when the minority is still following the Bezdin, and they would still have to bring their own carbon chatas. Says the pasuk v'ksiv, but doesn't the pasuk say me'amaretz b'shigus ma'isud ksiv? Doesn't the pasuk seem to imply that the person made the mistake by himself, and not that he's following Bezdin? You see, the pasuk of carbon chatas says that if a guy made a mistake, but on his own, me'amaretz, because he didn't know the halacha, he has to bring a carbon chatas. So the pasuk is not discussing. The pasuk is not discussing whether he is following Bezdin. Alalav hachi ka'amar. But the brisa means to say like this: Miyat kahal shechata b'shigigas ma'isa chayavim. If like 30% of the Jewish people did an aveira, they are obligated to bring their own carbon chatas. If they're not following Bezdin, she'ein Bezdin mevi'in al yadein par b'hayra, because even if they were following the Hayrais of Bezdin, Bezdin will never bring a carbon par, because Bezdin will only bring their par helen davar shel tzibur is only if the majority did the Avera. But if the minority did the Avera, Bezdin's not bringing anything. And because of that, since they don't have the Patur of Bezdin, that's why if they did an Avera, the minority of the Jewish people, they have to bring their own carbon chatas. So says the Brisa, Yochol Roiv Tzibush also B'shigas Maisiyeh Peturim, Shei Bezdin Mevin Aleim Par Ba'ira. I would think, now the Brisa is coming to tell you that I would think if 70% of the Jewish people did the same Avera, they would always be potter. Because when 70% of follow the Jewish, the Bezdin, the 70% are potter from carbon chatas. So I would say that even when they're not following Kairos Bezdin, since they're the majority, maybe the Torah says that they don't have to bring a carbon chatas. And that's what the Bryce is saying. Talmud Loima ba'amoras afilu rubai. Even if most of the Klal Yisrael did the Avera, albeit if they're not following the Psaka Bezdin, they're doing it on their own, they have to each bring a carbon chatas. But what you do see from this Brisa is that the minority that follows the Hayro'is Bezdin, the minority that follows the Psaka Bezdin, they are obligated to nevertheless bring a carbon chatas, which is not like our Mishnah. So that opinion is the Chachamim. So Gemara just wants to maybe say another pshat in the Brisa, and then the Gemara is going to come back to what we're trying to say. Amar Papa Mai, how do you know you're correct in your understanding of the Brisa? Maybe Dilma loy heim v'loy bezdin. Maybe when the minority does an Avera, and they're following the Psaka Bezdin, maybe the Brisa holds that the Bezdin doesn't bring, and they're not going to bring. Ihachi, then therefore, if they're not going to bring, when they don't have to bring a Kar Mechasas when they're following Bezdin, so how do you know when 30% of Klal Yisrael did an Aveira, how do you know they will have to bring their own person a Chatas? Maybe only if one person did an Aveira, he brings a Chatas. But if 30% of Klal Yisrael bring an Aveira, how do you know they bring a Chatas? My area the Mekahadal Rubi Lechiyuva, Lav Meklad Mute by Ra Kaibel Lay, the Mechai by Ra. Says the Gemara, V'ned the Bereisha al muted the Bechai b'shigas ma'isa. First, try to establish that when 30% do an avera by their own ideas, that they have to bring a chatas, and then then decide, then seek after that if 70% do an avera without bezdin, they also have to bring a carbon chatas. Elalav. Since the Brisa doesn't research regarding if you follow, when 30% follow their own idea and do an avera, it's understood from this brisa that they chayiv to bring their own carbon chatas. So here you proof miyat b'hayra chayiv, that miyat 30% of Klal Yisrael, even though they're paskening, they're following the Psaka Bezdin, chayovim, they're still mechuyev their own personal chatas, hen kizbo seira, whether sheep or a goat. Ushaloi bayras b'shigas ma'isa, and if they just following their own volition, again chayavin, they're still going to be chayiv a carbon. Now michte. So the first brisa is Rabbi Yehuda that holds a yachid is potter, that the miyut is potter if they're following Harais Bezdin. And the second brisa is the Rabbanim that holds miyat is chayev if they're following Hadrois Bezin. Says the Gemara, Memai, Michte, Tavai Stamik Tanam, Memai de Kamais Rabbi Yehuda, Basrais Rabbanam, Eime Ipcha. How do you know which brisa is Rabbi Yehuda and which brisa is Rabbanim? And says the Gemara, the first brisa must be Rabbi Yehuda. Man Shamat Le the Darish Miyut Kai Gavna, Rabbi Yehuda he. Rabbi Yehuda always darshans limitations in psukim. The Tanya we learned in the brisa, Rabbi Yehuda Oima, we go to Amid Aleph, Gimel Amid Aleph, Zois Taras Ha'oila, he had another place where he darshaned limitations in the pasuk. So the first brisa that darshaned a limitation that said that the only time a miyut of Klal Yisrael would bring their own carbon chatas is if they were not following Harois Bezdin. They're doing it on their own volition. So then they don't bring their carbon chatas. So that must be Rabbi Yehuda. The second brisa must be Rabban. But this brisa seems to say Roy v'kal shechatu bezdin mevi'in ayideim par. This brisa says that when Bezdin brings when 70% of Klal Yisrael did an Avera, then the Bezdin brings one cow. The Rabbi Yehuda, but if you go according to Rabbi Yehuda, Ha'amat Tzibo Huda Maisi, Bezdin Loy. Only he says that the 12 tribes bring their own carbon chatas and not the Bezdin. The Tanan, we learned in the Brisa, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Shivan Shvatim Shechatu, if there was only 7 Shavits that followed the Bezdin, Mevi and Zayin Param. It's not that the Sanhedrin brings the par, it's they bring, each Shavit brings their own par. Bottom line, where we're holding over here is a simple machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. And our Mishnah follows Rabbi Yehuda. What is the machlokes? Whether a minority of Klal Yisrael followed the psak of Bezdin, are they required to bring their own personal carbon chatas? Rabbi Yehuda says no, and that's the author of our Mishnah. The Rabbanan say yes, and they disagree with our Mishnah. Rab Nachman Amar Shmuel Zu Divrei Rab Meir. Rab Nachman says that our Mishnah follows Rab Meir. Ava Chachamim Maimer Yochid Shasu by Raz Bezdin Chayev. Man Rabbeinu Mai Rabbanim. Who's Rab Meir and who's Rabbanim? The Tanya we learned in the Brisa Hoyru v'Asu. If Bezdin gave a psak and people followed, Rab Meir Poiter v'Chachamim Chayvim. So the Gemara, that's also a cryptic brisa. Man also, who did the Avera? Ilema Bezdin. If Bezdin paskin and did the Avera themselves, my time of the Rabbanan Mechayve. So why would the Rabbanan be Mechayve a par helam shtovash at Sibar? Vatanya yochel hayre Bezdin also Bezdin yochel chayavim tamad loima hakol va'asu. Maisa tolibakal. We need Klal Yisrael to do the Avera, not the Bezdin did the Avera. In order to bring the par helam dovash at Sibar, it has to be that Bezdin gives the psak, and the action of the Avera has to do with Bezdin. Vayra tluya bebezdin. Ela hoyru Bezdin v'osu rav kal. This machlekes is if the Bezdin did a psak and most of the tzibur followed it. Then if that's the case, my time of the Rabbi Yehuda married a poiter. Why does Rabbi Meir say you're potter? That's exactly what a par helam dovash on tzibur is. Bezdin paskins and most of Klal Yisrael does the Avera. Alalav, it must be that the machlokes between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim is the following: Hari Bezdin v'asu miyat hakol. If Bezdin paskin and 30% of Klal Yisrael did the Avera, how can we palgin? That's the machlokes. Mar sav yochid also by Rez Bezdin potter, or Mar sav yochid also by Rez Bezdin chayev. And the Chachamim hold chayev in such a case, and Rabbi Meir holds potter, and our Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Meir. So the Gemara says, Amar Papa not so. To Kuli Alma yochid also by Rez Bezdin potter. Everybody holds Yochid that did Horayos Bezdin, that means a miut of Klal Yisrael follows the Psak of Bezdin, they're potter from their own carbon chatas, and the Chachamim would agree to our Mishnah. So what is the Chachamim arguing? Al-Bad Bezdin Mashlim Roiv Tzibah Kamim Palgate. Marsova Bezdin Mashlim Roiv Tzibah, or Marsova Ein Bezdin Mashlim Roiv Tzibah. The Mechlekes between Meir and Chachamim is a unique case, which is, well, let's say 50% of Klal Yisrael did the Avera. You need to get them over the 50% mark. So if you count the Bezdin that did the Avera, then you get over the 50% mark. So Rav Meir says you can't count the Bezdin. And the Chachamim say you could count the Bezdin. That's what the Machlekes is all about. The Ibai is saying, Bezdin also Rubish Akal. The Machlekes is actually Bezdin Paskin, and most of Klal did it. And Man Chachamim Shemin, Bezdin Maisi. When the Chachamim say you're Chayev, and Rav Meir says the apotter, the question is, do the Shvatim bring their own carbon? Of course, it's a par helam dovash tzibur. Rav Meir says the Shvatim apotter, only the Bezdin brings it. The Chacham is saying no, every Shevet brings their own par helam dovash tzibur. The Ibai is saying, if you want, I can tell you, Shevet also by Raz Bezdinu. Man Chacham Rabbi Yehudi, the time Shevet also by Raz Bezdin, Oisa Shevet Chayev. It's a unique case where only one Shevet followed the Hira of Bezdin. And Rameir says, so there is no Par Helam Dovash Tzibur. It's only one Shevet. And Rabbi Yehuda says, wait a second. And that's the Chachamim, who is Rabbi Yehuda, who says that Shevet brings their own Par Helam Dovash Tzibur. The Ibai said, if you want, I can tell you, let's say 6 Shvatim did the Avera, and then they're majority. Or you have 7 Shvatim, but they're the minority of the population. What do you do then? Money, Reb Shimon ben Lazahi. The Tanya, Reb Shimon ben Lazahi, the chayiv a carbon chatas. Shiva, even if you have 7 shvatim, afal pishein Reuben shakal, even though they're not the majority of people, chayavim. And that's the machlekes between Rab Meir and the Chachamim. Very important machlekes. The way the Gemara reinterprets the machlekes. Rab Meir holds that you need actual majority of people and majority of shvatim, or at least half the shvatim. A majority of shvatim and a majority of people. And if you don't have that, you're potter from Par Hilm Dovish and Tzibor. But according to the Chachamim, if you have the majority of people, even though you don't have the majority of shvatim, or you have the majority of shvatim, but you do not have the majority of people, nevertheless, you'll still be chayav a carbon chatas. Now the Gemara goes on to a very fundamental point. What is it? How do you count the people of Klal Yisrael who follow the Bezdin? Well, the Gemara is going to prove that if you live outside of Israel, you're not counted. The majority of people in Israel have to follow the Bezdin, but we don't count the people living in America. Amar Ravasi said, to determine the majority, you go after the most people living in Eretz Yisrael. He made a party when he built the base of Migdash. He had Gans Klal Yisrael there and an entire kahal, a big kahal. Why does it say that he had the entire congregation of Israel there? It already said he had Gans Klal Yisrael there. So why does it repeat kahal gadol? So Shema Mino, you hear from there, Hani hu di ikri kahal, alahanach le ikri kahal. When it comes to kahal, to count the kahal, then we only count people living in Israel, not people outside of Eretz Yisrael. Now the Gemara goes into a couple of questions. Pshita. Merubim v'nismatu hainu pliktu Rab Shimon Rabbanan. Here the Gemara says a very interesting thing. Let's say most of Klal Yisrael did the Avera, following the Psaka Bezdin. But then a plague happened, and those people that did the Avera died. And now they're the minority. Do you bring a carbon chata? Do you bring the Par Helam Dovish Tzibor? Rab Shimon would hold, we'll see later on, that Rab Shimon would hold you go after now, and right now they're the minority, so they'll be potter. Rabbanim says, no, you go after how they were before. And before they were obligated to bring a par, even though they got whittled down, they'll chayev to bring the carbon chata, par helam davar shetziba. What happens? The opposite case. Miyotam and Israbu Mao. Let's say they were the minority. 40% of Klal Yisrael did an avera. So you don't bring a par helam davar shetziba. A plague happens, and now it turns out that the 40% are now the majority of Klal Yisrael. So do they bring a carbon chatas? Would you say me pligi Rab Shimon Rabbanan? Rab Shimon da also basi yediyah mechayev. Rab Shimon who says you look at them now. So you go now, and right now when they decide to bring a par, they're the majority. So you'll be obligated to bring a par helm dam shutziba. Rabbanan da also basi chatas. You look at when they did the Avera. When they did the Avera, they were the minority. Patri. They're Patra. Or there's another way to understand the Machlekes Rab Shimon and Rabbanan. So the Gemara says, V'tizbara, that doesn't make sense. Rab Shimon always says that you go both. You need the when you did the Avera, Yadi to be Chayev, and also when you found out that you did the Avera, you have to be in the same obligation. For example, a guy did an Avera, and he found out that he did the Avera, and then all of a sudden he was appointed to be a Kohen Gadol. Nevertheless, Rab Shimon would agree that he brings the regular plain Karban Chatas, not the Kohen Gadol's Karban Chatas. But Heicha Dahavi Yadiyah V'Chata B'Chiyav, Yadiyah D'Loi Chata Mishamadle, when he found out he was in an obligation, but when he did the Avera, he was not in an obligation, who said that he would bring a Karban Chatas? Then came Leisi Kihashta. Then Rabbi Shimon should hold that if a person did an Avera when he was a plain person, and then he got appointed to be Kohen Gadol, and then he found out he did an Avera when he was a plain person, Rabbi Shimon says you don't have to bring a carbon. Why not? Bring a carbon the way a Kohen Gadol would bring a carbon. Because the answer is because Rabbi Shimon holds you need, in order to be Chayev Chatas, you need to be, when you did the Avera Chayev, and when you found out that you did the Avera, you're obligated to bring. Over here, when Klal Yisrael did the Avera, they were the minority. Later on, when they want to bring the carbon, you make a recount, they're the majority, that's not going to work. And therefore, everybody's going to hold that if they were the minority, even if they became the majority, they're potter from a carbon from the par helam davar tzibah. Now comes the Gemara like this. Okay, new questions. We're going to go a few minutes over, a little bit, like to a few more minutes. Let's say 30% of Klal Yisrael did the Avera, okay? And then the Chazar Bezdin. Bezdin retracted and made a mistake. And then they said, you know what? They paskined again that it's mutter. And another 30% did it. Do you combine those two 30% to get a majority? Since Bezdin retracted their psak in between, so you don't combine the two minorities of Klal Yisrael. Since the Aver is the same, eating fats, right? So then you do combine them. What happens? Let's say the two different psaks of Bezdin. The first time they gave up psak, they said you're allowed to eat the fats on top of the stomach. Then they retracted it. Then they gave a psak that you're allowed to eat the fats on top of the intestines. Then they retracted that. Each time they gave the psak that you could, 30% of Klal Yisrael followed them. So, what would you say in that case? It's two different psaks of two different items. Fats on the stomach, fats on the intestines. Dilma, would you say, since this topic is the same, mitzdaraf, you would combine them to be a majority. What happens? The first time they gave a psak that chaylev is mutar. The second time, and 30% of Klal Yisrael followed them. The second time they gave up psak, they said blood is mutar. Mahu. So, hacha, the trey surah ninu, the kibin the ein isur shava, like mitzdaraf. They're two different isurim. One is they gave a heter on fats, then they gave a heter on blood. You don't combine them. Dilma, do you say kibin the carbon shava mitzdaraf? Since if you eat chaylev by mistake, you bring a carbon chatas. If you eat dam by mistake, you bring a carbon chatas. So they're similar averis. So if Bezdin made a mistake in these two areas, even though miyat of Klal Yisrael followed each psak, you combine them so that Bezdin would have to bring their par helam davar shel tzibur. The intim tzolaima, the kivin the carbon shava mitzdaraf miyat bechel miyat avodah mahu. Let's say the other avera that the Bezdin gave a heter on was avodah zara. Here, hachavada ain't isurin shava. They're not the same avera. One's chaylev, one's avodah zara. They ain't karbanon shava, and they're not the same carbon. One chaylev, you bring a carbon chatas. Avodah zara, you bring a seir for a chatas. It's a different type of carbon. Since both of them, if you did it on purpose, without warning, then you would get kares. So therefore, it's the same type of avera, and you would combine the two minorities. So therefore, Teku the Gemara remains unresolved. Ibayelahu. One more question. Har bezdin shechelev mutar v'asu miyat hakol meis oisa bezdin v'omed bezdin achar v'chazor v'hazu oisa miyat achar. So bezdin did paskin, and then and chelev is mutar, and 30% followed them. Then everybody in bezdin died. And another Bezdin came and paskin the same way, and another 30% did it. According to the opinion that the par is brought by the Bezdin, well, the first Bezdin is not here, so of course there's no par helam davar shel tzibur. They died. According to the opinion that says each shevet brings their own par, mao. What would be in this case? Again, the case is Bezdin paskin chaylev is mutter. 30% of Klal Yisrael followed them. Then they died out. The Bezdin died out. Now a new Bezdin shot up, gave the same psak, and 30% of Klal Yisrael followed them. Tzibur hakoy, the tzibur is around, so they should bring a carbon chatas. Dilmo maybe Yedia the who Bezdin the hard to but the same Bezdin, it's not the same Bezdin. It's a totally different Bezdin that gave the psak. One Bezdin gave the psak, then died out, and now you have a new Bezdin. So maybe there is no par helam davar tzibur. So the Gemara stops over here. So let's go one more, 2 more minutes, and then we'll stop. Amar Rabbi Yonis, and Rabbi Yonis said, if 100 people sit down as part of the 71, then the Gemara says that you need 100% everybody unanimous to agree to the psak. Shnema in kol adas Yisrael yishgu ach yishgu kulam. Even though normally there's 71, but if for some reason this Sanhedrin had 100 people, then we have to, all 100 have to agree to the same psak. Alma Rav Huna says that this makes sense, that hachinami mistabra, because the Torah tells you v'im kol adas Yisrael yishku, that the entire Bezdin made the mistake. The Gemara goes down and slugs it up. It's not true. Hachi kamar. This is what the pasuk says. I'm skipping all the way down right before the Mishnah. The Gemara is just going to slug it up, and it says like this: I'ika kulam. If you have 71 people, then have a ra. That's a psaka bezdin. V'iloi. But if you don't have full 71, let's say you have 68 of the bezdin. Loi have a ra. That's not a psak. But if you have 100 people, as long as you have 71 that agree to one psak, they're in the parsha of par helam davar tzibur. Concludes the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, right before the Mishnah. Yuch yoshvim badin. You have 10 people sitting in a din. Koila tolib b'tzavar kulam. Then everyone takes responsibility. It's like a handcuff neck, a handcuff around their necks, because they all have to be responsible. They can't say, "Oh, I'm relying on the other guy." So Gemara says, "Shita." Even if you have a student in the crowd and he knows something, he has required to say, hey, Bezdin, all 10 of you, you're making a mistake. And if he doesn't, then he's also responsible for this corruption of justice. Rav Huna was so scared to be part of a judgment, when he would sit in judgment, he would put 10 students that knew, all the Mishnayos in front of him. So that a little splinter from the beam should fall on them, because that he shouldn't take the full responsibility in case there's a mistake there. So he made sure to invite people, Talmidei Chachamim, to be in the crowd when he issued a psak. Rav Ashi, when they brought a treifa in front of him, and he had to paskin whether the animal was kosher or not, he would bring 10 butchers from the city, and he would debate in front of them. Amar, he said, the reason why I don't want to paskin myself, so a little splinter of the big beam should fall on them. In other words, he wanted to lighten the load upon himself, so he brought the butchers with him to help him decide the psak. So scared were they to make any type of error. Okay, we'll stop over here.